Another brand new graphics card has landed, and this time it's the Nvidia RTX 4070 Ti, a card that was originally intended to be the 12GB 4080 that then got cancelled / delayed and now renamed, but we'll gloss over that and treat this thing at face value. Have Nvidia got the answer to AMD's RX 7900 XT and XTX? Well, I guess in this video we're going to find out. I'll be testing this card out, running through the all-important benchmarks, and also showing you guys what build I would put together with a card like this to get optimal price to performance and ensure that the whole thing runs smoothly and looks the part. Let's do this. The Thermaltake Ceres 500 is a PC case with a difference. This impressive mid-tower has more than 60% of its panels perforated for maximum possible airflow, features 4 140mm RGB fans as standard, and even support for huge 420mm rads at the front. Plus, with an integrated GPU holder and optional LCD upgrade kit, you can customize this case to your heart's content. Learn more at the first links in the description below. This video is going to be comprised of 3 main sections. First, I'm going to run through the parts, then I'm going to build it, then check out the performance with loads of graphics tests of the 4070 Ti. Let's start off, shall we, with the 4070 Ti. What on earth is this thing? Where does it sit? And how can Nvidia avoid some of the controversy they've sort of been embroiled in as of late? And with the RTX 4080 drama, they made the right decision to postpone the 12GB card, which I suppose has eventually turned into this. Supporting all of the latest features from Nvidia like DLSS 3.0, the most mature ray tracing tech you can currently find on the market, with 12GB of video memory, and built on the Ada Lovelace architecture, which is Nvidia's next-gen 4000 series design. Previous cards in the form of the 4080 and 4090, while both pretty expensive, have delivered strong generational performance gains over the last gen, and the pricing on this card, at MSRP, looks to make it a bit more competitive, at least against its AMD competition. I've gone ahead and picked up this Gigabyte card. I'm informed that there's no Founders Edition this time around. Inside the box for this Gigabyte card, you get a GPU support bracket. I'm hoping this thing isn't going to be quite as big as the 4080 and 4090 cards, which by all accounts were pretty ginormous, and is instead going to provide a bit more of a holdable package, shall we say. No, maybe let's not say that. Anyway, so 2-slot form factor this time around rather than 3 slots. There's a little bit of overhang, but nothing too great. The length is pretty big. This is a pretty long graphics card, accounting for Gigabyte's 3-fan cooler. You can also see, this is pretty interesting as well, the PCB on this card is really short, hence the power connector being quite so inland. That for me would indicate that other manufacturers are certainly going to bring out smaller form factor versions than this. This is obviously one of Gigabyte's more beefed up factory overclocked cards. I/O is what we'd expect from the generation, HDMI 3 display ports. It's PCIe Gen 4, not Gen 5 on the interface, so you don't need any expensive new motherboard to make it work. All in all, looks pretty good, and if we compare it to some of the competition, without ruining all of the performance numbers later, you can see exactly how it stacks up. While it beats out the RTX 3090 Ti in pretty much all cases, it does fall understandably short of the 4080 and doesn't really compete that well with AMD's new 7900 series. In titles where DLSS 3 and frame generation are at play, Nvidia obviously see a bit of an advantage, but coming in at an MSRP of $799 and even more for AIB aftermarket units, I can't help but feel like this thing lacks a bit of excitement for the price. So that's the graphics card of choice, and we'll come back to this obviously when we install it and test it in more detail later on. I'll be coupling it up with the Intel Core i5-13600K. If you're wondering why I've picked this CPU, in short, it's the best CPU for gaming right now. With 14 cores and 20 threads, this absolutely dominates its AMD competition. There's 2 graphs you need to see, single-threaded and multi-threaded. This thing is incredible. Intel killed it with 13th gen, and the i5 is, in my opinion, the best chip of the lot, especially when it comes to price to performance. I'll be installing it onto this Gigabyte's Z790 Aorus Elite AX. It's one of the more affordable Z790 chipset motherboards, meaning we can overclock the 13600K. That's obviously a really good thing. Access PCIe Gen 4 and Gen 5 on the M.2 and full X16 length slots. And it's also got integrated Wi-Fi, meaning that we can connect up to the internet nice and easily. No Wi-Fi cards, no Ethernet cables needed here. Wi-Fi 6E on this thing as well. Memory will be provided by this 32GB kit of Thermaltake's ToughRAM X6 RGB D5, very catchy name, Thermaltake, with a nice RGB diffuse strip at the top and some cool polished metal accents. It's one of my favourite looking kits of DDR5 memory and performs pretty well too. I'll link the RAM with all the other parts for latest pricing and availability down in the description below. Storage is provided by a Samsung SSD 980. I'd recommend you pick up a 1TB or a 2TB drive depending on how many games you want to store. This is an awesome little drive though, with speeds in the region of 3.5 gigabytes a second. Just about enough for the 4070 Ti to ensure any storage-based bottlenecks. Fan-wise, I've picked up some of Thermaltake's fancy Toughfan 12 RGB. I'll be talking about these later with their very, very cool design. And a cooler from Thermaltake too, in the form of their Toughliquid 360. A great looking and performing design that's only missing one thing, some RGB fans. And of course, as you guys can see, I've fixed that without a problem. To round things off with the case and the power supply, I've got to give a shout out to Thermaltake, who sent out their Ceres 500TG ARGB. It's one of their latest, flashiest cases, and I'm excited to see how it performs. It's even got an integrated display module, which is pretty sick, and I'll of course be evaluating this in more detail later on. An RGB ToughPower power supply is going to round things out nicely, and also boasts support for the PCIe Gen 5 connector out of the box, meaning no cable clutter for us, no horrible adapters, and no risks of fire. Anyway, with all of the parts covered off, let's get this thing put together. First up is, of course, the CPU, motherboard, RAM, and SSD to complete the motherboard assembly. Given just how good Intel 13th Gen is, it feels like the only CPUs I install at the moment in build guides on the channel are Intel, which is kind of sad, but I know that AMD will be back, Team Red will be back on the hunt for CPUs soon, but for now, we're just going to have to stick with Intel. Memory is next, and you guys will be able to see exactly what I mean when I say that this stuff looks pretty good. Oh, yes. Love the little metallic accents, the two-tone design. Thermaltake have killed it with this. Finally, to wrap things up, just got to pop the SSD in. We'll be doing so underneath the included M.2 heatsink, which will keep the drive cool and also just aesthetically looks a bit better. The final thing I'm going to just do here is also add in some of our CPU cooler mounting hardware, so a backplate and then also the screws that go through it, and we'll fasten in the water block a bit later. Doing this now is way easier, trust me. And then it is case time. Now, I mentioned this case briefly a bit earlier, but the only way to properly look at it is to get it out of the box. First impressions are pretty good. So you've got this cool mesh front panel with the circles, which I quite like the look of. Spinning around, you've got a tempered glass panel, which is hinged and opens nice and easily with a little twisty thumb screw. Support for eATX motherboards, a vertical GPU mount, 3 140s at the front, a 140 at the back, and mesh everywhere. This thing is going to be a beast for airflow, which is exciting. First things first though, install the motherboard. Take off all the panels, front, top, both the sides. Keep them safe for later, as you'll need to, well, obviously put them back on. With all of this in, it's time to pop in the radiator next and liquid cool the i5 before finally, and I'm so excited for this, putting in the 4070 Ti. Now then, the radiator is probably going to be best installed at the top. The 140s in the front are pretty large, too large in fact for the radiator, and make sense to stay where they are. So I'm going to add in the radiator to the top with the fans underneath and the cool RGB of these aftermarket units. Run all of the cables and pop the water block over the 4 posts I prepped a little bit earlier. In theory, nice and simple. Sadly, there's no removable bracket to make it easier on the top of the case, but they should go in with no problems nevertheless. Here we go, it is time. Now the case does technically support a vertical GPU mount, but I think I'm going to opt for the standard horizontal configuration in this build, as it'll still look pretty good. It's going to fill the case out nicely and match the overall aesthetic. Couple of screws to remove, GPU to clip in, easy peasy. Oh yes, lovely stuff. And a couple more screws, the ones we just took out, ironically, to fasten back into place and stop that from happening. And that is looking awesome. The only final step really is to add in Thermaltake's RGB 850 watt power supply and plug in all the wires and connectors before booting this thing out to test out the performance in just a moment. But first, how good it looks when it's all powered up. Let's take a look. So then, the all-important question of performance. The real determining factor as to whether the 4070 Ti is actually worth it or whether you should give it a miss. Let's start off with Apex Legends, and with the 4070 Ti we achieved 145 FPS on average at 4K high. A respectable result, beating out the 3090 Ti from last gen, the previous top-end Halo product, but falling short to its AMD rivals and bigger brother 4080 and 4090. AMD do tend to rank better though in Apex Legends on the whole, something you can also see when we scale down to 1440p. The 4070 Ti was pretty much level pegging with the 3090 and 3090 Ti, perhaps indicating a little bit of a CPU bottleneck here, while the 7900 XTX and the 4080 and 4090 stormed considerably ahead. Move through into Battlefield 2042, and in this title, the 4070 Ti sat below its 4080 and 4090 brothers, and fairly considerably lower than the $1,000 MSRP 7900 XTX. It did beat out the 3090 and fell just short on the 3090 Ti, aligning with roughly where we'd expect. Moving to 1440p, and it's actually a slightly better story, with the RTX 4070 Ti just 2 frames per second lower than the 4080, while AMD's 7900 XTX and the more pricey Nvidia 4090 did win out yet again. Move through into Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings, and AMD's immense straight rasterization performance paid dividends. This card though, knocking pretty close on the door with the 4080 16GB, and not a million miles off the 4090. The consensus so far then that the 4070 Ti is pretty decent, but it's got to cost less than AMD's new 7000 series cards. Move through into GTA 5 at 4K high settings, and the 70 Ti put in a good showing once again. It beat out the 3090 and 3090 Ti from last gen. That's a pretty impressive bump really. 3090 Ti was obviously a $1,500 card, this one considerably cheaper, and did just drop below the 7900 XTX, though it got close within 4 frames per second in Grand Theft Auto. We did have a few inconsistent results though with the 4070 Ti that are worth pointing out. We're sure these will be ironed out by game devs and with future driver updates, but take Halo Infinite as an example. 4K high settings, it actually got beaten by its 3090 brother, which is pretty poor, but tuned down to 1440p, and it beat all of its last gen Nvidia rivals and even the new 7900 XTX. Thankfully, Spiderman's Miles Morales was a more consistent result, 108 frames a second, that's 3 lower than the 4080, 4 lower than the 7900 XTX, and around 10 lower than the 4090. Valorant also performed pretty well, falling just short to the Nvidia rivals in terms of the 4080 and the 4090, at both 4K high settings and 1440p. Our COD Warzone results were a little disappointing, falling short just marginally to the RTX 3090 Ti from last generation, and being put to bed by its AMD competition. So then, is the RTX 4070 Ti worth considering or even buying at its $799 MSRP price point? The answer for me is a difficult one. While this card beats out all the cards from the last generation, there's currently no next gen option to compare it against. Not until AMD released their RX 7800 series. And I can't lie to you, $799, while a lot cheaper than the existing 4000 series cards, feels a lot of money to spend for a 70 tier graphics card. Thank goodness for Nvidia's sake that this wasn't launched with the 4080 name, as the performance difference between this and the 16GB model is simply too large. At $100 cheaper, I would have said this card was a great buy, and while I don't think it's a terrible value proposition, it's certainly not a GPU that's going to change the world, at just shy of $800. You can learn more about this card in our full review below. Make sure to get subscribed if you like what you see here on the GeekaWhat channel. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.